The spring of 1964, a hospital in New York, a 55-year-old man who wants to be president of the United States is pacing, waiting for news that should be the happiest of his life. His young wife is giving birth to their son, and that baby, arriving healthy and wailing into the world, is about to end his father's dream of the presidency. Not through any fault of the child, not through any scandal in the delivery room, but because the timing of that birth, days before the most important vote of Nelson Rockefeller's political life, would remind millions of American voters of exactly the thing he most needed them to forget: that the woman in that hospital bed had, barely a year earlier, been another man's wife and the mother of 4 other children. That to marry Nelson Rockefeller, she had walked away from that marriage and, in the arrangement that scandalized the nation, from the day-to-day custody of those children, and that Rockefeller himself had shattered a 31-year marriage to be with her. The baby was proof, living, breathing, impossible to ignore proof, arriving at the worst possible moment that the whispers were all true. And here is the strangest part of the whole story, the part that makes it worth telling at all. Nelson Rockefeller almost certainly could have been president if he had simply been willing to lie. If he had stayed in his cold, dead 31-year marriage for the sake of appearances, kept the picture intact for the voters, and conducted his love for Happy in secret the way powerful men had always conducted such things, the path to the White House would very likely have stayed open. The scandal that destroyed him was not corruption. It was not a crime. It was honesty. He refused to hide the person he loved, and his own country punished him for it more severely than it would have punished almost any lie. Within days, Nelson Rockefeller would lose the California primary. Within weeks, his campaign for the Republican nomination would be finished, and the man who had been, just a year before, the clear frontrunner to lead his party and quite possibly the country, would watch the nomination go instead to a conservative senator from Arizona named Barry Goldwater, setting in motion a transformation of American politics that is still unfolding today. All of it, or at least a decisive piece of it, traced back to a marriage. To a woman named Happy. You have almost certainly never heard of her. Margaretta Large Fitler. Murphy Rockefeller, known her entire life by the childhood nickname Happy, is not a figure most Americans could name. She left no great public legacy of her own, sought no spotlight, and spent most of her life as a wealthy, private, and by all accounts genuinely kind woman who wanted very little more than to be with the man she loved. And that is precisely what makes her story so strange and so revealing. Because this quiet, private woman, who never ran for anything and never wanted power, became, through nothing more than the fact of her marriage, one of the most consequential wives in 20th century American politics. Her wedding helped derail a presidential campaign, hand a nomination to the opposing wing of a political party, and push American conservatism onto the path it has followed ever since. So how does that happen? How does a private woman's marriage help decide who runs for president? Why did a rich, popular, powerful governor throw away his frontrunner status to marry her, knowing exactly what it might cost? What was the arrangement about her children that turned public opinion so violently against them both? And how did the birth of a baby, one small, ordinary human event, become the final blow that ended a man's lifelong ambition? Stay with me. Because the story of Happy Rockefeller is not really a story about a scandal. It is a story about love colliding with ambition at the highest level of American power, about a moment when the private choices of 2 people reshaped the public future of a nation, and about the price a woman paid, quietly and for the rest of her life, for the crime of marrying the wrong man at the wrong time. Before we go back to the beginning, hold on to a few things, because each one is a thread that runs straight into that hospital room. The man in question was not just a candidate. He was the frontrunner, the heir to the greatest fortune in American history, favored to lead his party and perhaps the country. To marry the woman he loved, he ended a 31-year marriage, and she ended hers to a friend of his, both within about a year. The custody arrangement that followed would be turned into the single most damaging word in the whole scandal. And the loss of that one primary would help hand his party to a movement that has shaped American politics ever since. Keep those in mind. Each one is documented, and together they explain how a quiet woman's wedding became a hinge of American history. To understand how a marriage brought down a campaign, you first have to understand the almost unimaginable heights the man in question was falling from. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was not just wealthy, he was a Rockefeller, which in mid-20th century America meant something close to royalty. He was the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the oil titan who had been the richest man in American history. The Rockefeller name was a synonym for wealth so vast it was almost abstract. Nelson was born in 1908 into that dynasty, into a world of estates and art collections and private fortunes, and he was raised with the expectation that a Rockefeller does not merely enjoy his money, but uses it to shape the world. To grasp what that name meant, understand that the Rockefeller fortune was not old money quiet. It was the single most famous fortune in the country, built by the man who had, more than any other, defined what it meant to be rich in America. To be born a Rockefeller in 1908 was to be born into something closer to an American aristocracy than almost anything else the Republic produced. The family gave away money on a scale that reshaped medicine and education and the arts. They built Rockefeller Center. Their name was on universities and foundations, and they were raised, the Rockefeller children, with an ethic that wealth carried obligation, that a Rockefeller owed the world service in exchange for the extraordinary hand he had been dealt. Nelson absorbed that lesson completely, and it turned into ambition, and the ambition turned toward politics and, ultimately, toward the presidency itself. And Nelson wanted to shape the world through politics. He served in Washington under Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower, working on foreign affairs and public policy. And in 1958, he was elected governor of New York, the most powerful governorship in the country, and he was extraordinarily good at it. He was energetic, ambitious, genuinely talented, a builder of universities and highways and public institutions on a massive scale. He was re-elected again and again. He was charismatic, backslapping, endlessly confident, a man who greeted strangers with a booming hiya fella and seemed to fill every room he entered. And he was, by the early 1960s, the leading figure of a particular kind of Republican that has almost entirely vanished today. The moderate liberal, Eastern establishment Republican. Pro-business but comfortable with an active government, socially moderate, internationalist, the republicanism of Wall Street and the Ivy League rather than the small towns and the growing conservative movement of the South and West. This wing was so dominant and Nelson so central to it that the entire type came to be known by his name. They were called Rockefeller Republicans. It is worth understanding just how commanding that position was because it makes the fall so much steeper. In the early 1960s, the moderate Eastern wing was not some embattled faction. It was, in many ways, the establishment of the Republican Party, the mainstream, the presumed future. The conservatives rallying around Goldwater were still widely seen as an insurgency, a fringe, a movement that serious people assumed could never actually capture a major party. Nelson Rockefeller sat at the very top of the respectable, expected establishment path to the presidency. He was not the underdog. He was the favorite, the safe bet, the man the smart money backed, which is exactly why what happened next was so shocking and why a marriage that helped topple him from that height was not a small thing, but a genuine turning of the wheel of history. And in the run-up to 1964, Nelson Rockefeller was the frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination. He led the polls. He had the money, obviously. He had the organization, the name, the record, the charisma, the path to the nomination, and quite possibly the presidency was open in front of him. There was only one problem, and the problem was his heart, because Nelson Rockefeller, the great frontrunner, was not happy in his marriage and had not been for a long time. In 1930, just days after graduating from Dartmouth, he had married Mary Todd Hunter Clark, known as Todd. It was, in many ways, an appropriate match, a union of the right sort of families. They were married for over 3 decades. They had 5 children. They built the outward picture of a solid, established, dynastic marriage. But by the late 1950s, that marriage had gone cold. Nelson and Todd had grown apart, living increasingly separate lives behind the dignified facade. And somewhere in those years, Nelson Rockefeller fell in love with someone else. Her name was Margaretta Murphy. Everyone called her Happy. She was 18 years younger than Nelson, born in 1926 into a prominent, wealthy Philadelphia family, the Fittlers. She had earned the nickname Happy as a child for her sunny, cheerful disposition, and it stuck for life, which tells you something about the kind of person she was: warm, sweet-natured, easy to be around. She had married a man named James Murphy, a physician, and by the time she and Nelson grew close, she and Murphy had 4 children together. Picture the world she lived in before Nelson. She was, on paper, exactly where a woman of her background was supposed to be. Married to a respectable doctor, mother of 4, settled into the comfortable, expected life of the wealthy Northeastern establishment, the charity committees and the dinner parties and the summers at the right addresses. She had done everything right by the rules of her class and her era. And into that orderly, expected life came Nelson Rockefeller, a force of nature, 18 years her senior, magnetic and powerful and utterly certain. And something in her chose him over the entire safe structure of the life she already had. That is the quiet courage buried inside this story that the scandal completely erased. Happy Murphy risked everything: her reputation, her marriage, her children, her standing, for love, at a time when a woman who did that could expect to be destroyed for it, and she was very nearly right about the destruction. And here is the detail that mattered most, the one that would prove politically radioactive. James Murphy was not a stranger to Nelson Rockefeller. He was a friend, and Happy had, for a time, worked on Rockefeller's own staff. So this was not a distant romance between 2 unattached people. This was the wife of a friend and associate, a mother of 4, falling in love with a married governor who was the father of 5. 2 intact families, 2 sets of children, 2 marriages, all standing in the way. For years, it was kept quiet. The relationship between Nelson and Happy developed over something like 5 years, discreetly out of the public eye. And it might have stayed that way, a private matter managed behind the walls of wealth and discretion. Except that Nelson Rockefeller was not a man content to keep the great love of his life a secret. He wanted to marry her. And to marry her, everything hidden would have to become public. The unraveling began with the divorces. In 1961, Nelson and Todd Rockefeller announced their separation. In March of 1962, after 31 years of marriage, they divorced. For a public figure of Rockefeller's stature in that era, this alone was a significant event. Divorce still carried real stigma in early 1960s America, especially for a man with presidential ambitions. No divorced man had ever been elected president. It was widely considered a disqualifying mark, a sign of moral instability, a broken home that voters would not trust in the White House. It is genuinely hard, from where we stand now, to feel how heavy that stigma was. This was America before the divorce revolution, before it became ordinary, before half of all marriages ended in one. In the early 1960s, divorce still whispered of scandal and failure and moral weakness. For an ordinary person, it was a private embarrassment. For a man asking the entire country to trust him with its highest office, it was very close to disqualifying. The unspoken rule of American politics was simple and iron. The president had to embody the stable American family. He had to be the reassuring father figure with the intact home, and the loyal wife and the well-raised children. A divorced man broke that picture, and a divorced man who had left a 31-year marriage broke it badly. But a divorce on its own might have been survivable. What came next was not, because it quickly became clear why Nelson had divorced. Almost in parallel, Happy Murphy obtained her own divorce from James Murphy in the spring of 1963. And then, with a speed that stunned the country, on May 4th, 1963, barely a year after Nelson's own divorce and only about a month after Happy's, the two of them married. The wedding was held at the estate of Nelson's brother Lawrence in Pocantico Hills, New York. It was small, and the moment the news broke, it detonated. Part 2. To understand why the reaction was so ferocious, you have to add up everything the public was suddenly asked to absorb, all at once. A sitting governor, a man who wanted to be president, had ended a 31-year marriage. The woman he married was 18 years younger. She had been married to a friend of his. She had been on his staff. and she had 4 children. 2 households had been broken, 2 marriages dissolved, and it had all happened with a rapidity that made the sequence impossible to ignore. His divorce, her divorce, their wedding, compressed into barely a year. And then there was the detail that turned public sympathy to ash: the children. When Happy married Nelson, the custody arrangement for her 4 children left them primarily with their father, James Murphy. In the public understanding of the time, and in the brutal shorthand of the newspapers, Happy Rockefeller had given up her children to marry Nelson. Whatever the private truth of that arrangement, whatever the legal and personal complexities behind it, that was the story that reached the American public. A mother who had left her 4 children behind to marry a rich and powerful man. For an America that still held a rigid, sentimental, and deeply moralistic view of marriage and motherhood, this was almost unforgivable. It offended something people felt in their guts. A woman was supposed to sacrifice anything for her children, not give them up. And a man who wanted to lead the country was supposed to embody stable family virtue, not blow up 2 families to satisfy his own desires. And it is worth pausing here to be fair to Happy, because the public verdict was crueler than the private truth almost certainly was. The word abandon did enormous damage, and it was almost certainly unfair. Custody arrangements are complicated, private, and frequently misunderstood from the outside, and the shorthand that reached the newspapers, "Mother gives up children," flattened whatever the real arrangement was into its most damning possible form. Happy remained a mother to her children. The notion that she had coldly discarded them was a caricature, the kind of brutal simplification that a scandal-hungry press and a moralistic public will always reach for. But fairness had nothing to do with politics. What mattered, politically, was the story people believed, and the story people believed was devastating. The condemnation came from every direction. The press savaged them. Fellow Republicans recoiled. Even Nelson's own church, the United Presbyterian Church, became caught up in scrutiny and criticism of the marriage. One widely captured sentiment summed up the whole disaster in a single devastating observation: the rapidity of it all. One voice put it: he gets a divorce, she gets a divorce, and the indication of the breakup of 2 homes. Our country doesn't like broken homes. Our country doesn't like broken homes. That was the whole thing, in 9 words. It did not matter that Nelson and Happy genuinely loved each other. It did not matter that the first marriages were already dead. It did not matter that Happy was a kind and decent woman caught in an impossible situation. What the public saw was 2 broken homes and the ambition of a rich man who thought the rules did not apply to him. And the effect on his political fortunes was immediate and catastrophic. Watch what happened to the numbers, because the numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Before the marriage, Nelson Rockefeller was the front runner. He led the polls for the Republican nomination. He was the man to beat. After the marriage, his popularity, in the words of the historical record, plummeted. It did not dip. It did not soften. It collapsed. The scandal detonated directly underneath the most promising presidential campaign in the Republican Party, and the blast radius took out his lead almost overnight. Sit with how rare and how brutal that is in politics. Campaigns are usually damaged slowly by 1,000 small cuts, by drift and doubt and the grinding accumulation of ordinary mistakes. It is genuinely uncommon for a single, discreet, private event to visibly and immediately knock a frontrunner off his perch. But that is what the marriage did. There is a clean before and after. Before the wedding, Rockefeller leads. After the wedding, he is falling. The line on the graph bends at the exact moment he says his vows. You could hardly ask for a more direct demonstration that a private choice had a public price, and that the price was enormous. Now, here is where the larger forces of history come in, because Nelson Rockefeller's personal scandal did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at the exact moment that the Republican Party was fighting a civil war for its own soul, and his marriage handed a decisive weapon to the other side. On that other side stood Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona. Goldwater was everything Rockefeller was not. Where Rockefeller was the Eastern establishment, moderate, internationalist, comfortable with big government, Goldwater was the voice of a rising insurgent conservatism, of the South and the West, of small government and hard anti-communism, and a return to what his followers saw as traditional American values and moral order. The 1964 primary between them was not just a contest between two men, it was a battle over the future direction of the entire Republican Party. Would it remain the party of the moderate Rockefeller establishment, or would it be captured by the new conservative movement rallying behind Goldwater? And into that battle, at the worst possible moment, Nelson Rockefeller detonated a scandal about broken homes and abandoned children, and a rich man who divorced his wife of 31 years to marry a younger woman. You could hardly have designed a gift more perfectly suited to the Goldwater conservatives. Their entire appeal was about moral order, about traditional family values, about a country that had lost its way and needed to return to solid ground. And here was the leader of the opposing wing, living proof in their telling of exactly the moral decay they warned against. Rockefeller's marriage did not just hurt him personally. It became a symbol, a living argument for everything the conservative movement was saying about the moral bankruptcy of the establishment they wanted to overthrow. The marriage, in short, did not just damage a man, it helped a movement. Through late 1963 and into 1964, Rockefeller fought on, but he was wounded, and everyone knew it. The campaign ground toward its decisive moment, the California primary of June 1964. California was enormous, a winner-take-all prize, and it had become the effective battleground for the whole nomination. If Rockefeller could win California, he could stop Goldwater and perhaps resurrect his campaign. If he lost it, he was finished. And in the final days before that all-important vote, life delivered its cruelest possible piece of timing. Happy Rockefeller was pregnant. She had been pregnant during the campaign, and by the accounts of the time, she made a fine and appealing figure on the trail, warm and gracious, exactly the sort of candidate's wife who might have helped soften the scandal if given enough time. But time was the one thing they did not have. Because just days before the California primary, Happy gave birth to their son, Nelson Rockefeller Jr. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that piece of timing when you set the private moment beside the public one. In private, this was a joy. A man in his mid-50s, deeply in love with his young wife, holding a new son. By every human measure, it was one of the good days of a life. And at the very same moment, in public, that same event was a catastrophe. A bomb dropped on his own campaign by the simple biology of a due date that could not be moved. There was no way to hide a birth. There was no way to delay it past the primary. The most joyful private event of the year arrived, through nothing but the indifferent arithmetic of nature, at the single worst public moment it possibly could, and there was absolutely nothing either of them could do about it. Think about the timing of that, and think about what it did. For months, Rockefeller's campaign had been trying to move past the scandal, to let the memory of the divorces and the remarriage fade, to let voters focus on his record and his qualifications instead of his private life. And then, in the final stretch before the single most important vote of the entire race, his young second wife gave birth. The event was joyous in private and devastating in public because the birth of that baby dragged the entire scandal back onto the front pages at the worst possible moment. It was a fresh, undeniable physical reminder of everything the Goldwater forces wanted voters thinking about. Here was the new young wife. Here was the new baby. Here, in living form, was the second family that Nelson Rockefeller had built on the ruins of his first. The renewed attention to Rockefeller's family life, coming days before the vote, hurt him badly among the conservative California Republicans who would decide the primary. The timing could not have been worse. A wound that had been slowly scabbing over was ripped open at the exact moment it most needed to heal. On June 2nd, 1964, California went to the polls, and Barry Goldwater beat Nelson Rockefeller. It was close, but close was enough. California was winner-take-all, and Goldwater took all of it. And with California, he took the momentum, the delegates, and effectively the nomination. Rockefeller's campaign, already crippled by the scandal, could not survive the loss. He would formally fight on to the convention that summer, but the reality was settled on that June primary day. The frontrunner of a year earlier, the man who had led every poll, the golden heir of the greatest fortune in America, had been beaten. And a significant part of what beat him was a marriage. At the Republican convention that July, held at the Cow Palace in California, the conservative takeover was complete, and it was ugly. When Nelson Rockefeller rose to speak, the hall, packed with Goldwater's conservative delegates, erupted in booing and jeering so sustained and so hostile that he could barely be heard. It was one of the most dramatic scenes in modern convention history. The establishment champion literally shouted down by the movement that had displaced him. Goldwater won the nomination decisively. The party had chosen its new direction. Stand in that moment for a second, because it is one of the great turning points in American political history, and a marriage was tangled up in it. Here was Nelson Rockefeller, the heir to the most famous fortune in America, a four-term governor, a man who a year and a half earlier had been the favorite to become president, standing at a podium being booed into silence by his own party. The Rockefeller name, which had opened every door his entire life, could not buy him 30 seconds of quiet in that hall. The movement that was drowning him out did not care about his money or his record or his pedigree. To them, he was the past, the soft, compromised, morally suspect establishment they had come to overthrow. And the scandal of his marriage had become one of the sharpest symbols of everything they were overthrowing. The booing was not only about Happy, but Happy was part of what they were booing. Goldwater went on to lose the general election to Lyndon Johnson that November in one of the largest landslides in American history. But that landslide loss is deceptive, because in defeat, the Goldwater movement had permanently captured the Republican Party. The conservative wing that rose in 1964 never gave the party back. The path that ran from Goldwater's nomination would lead, in time, to Ronald Reagan and to the conservative movement that has defined the Republican Party ever since. The moderate Eastern establishment republicanism that Nelson Rockefeller embodied went into a decline from which it never recovered. Within a generation, the Rockefeller Republican was nearly extinct. And Nelson Rockefeller, personally, never reached the summit he had spent his life climbing toward. He tried again for the nomination in 1968 and failed again, losing to Richard Nixon. He never became president. The closest he ever came to national power was being appointed, not elected, vice president under Gerald Ford in 1974, a consolation prize handed to him at the end of his career after the office he had truly wanted had slipped forever out of reach. Happy became, for those years, the second lady of the United States, the closest either of them would come to the heights they had once been favored to reach. Now let me be honest with you about the sources and about the interpretation, because this is a story where the temptation to oversimplify runs in two directions, and both are wrong. The firm ground is not in dispute. Nelson Rockefeller divorced his first wife in 1962 after 31 years. Happy divorced James Murphy in 1963. They married in May 1963. The marriage ignited a national scandal centered on the divorces, the rapid remarriage, and the custody of Happy's children. Rockefeller's poll numbers collapsed. Happy gave birth to their son days before the California primary of June 1964. Rockefeller lost that primary to Goldwater, and with it, the nomination. All of this is thoroughly documented across contemporary reporting and mainstream history. Where honesty requires care is in the word the title uses. Destroyed. Did Happy Rockefeller's marriage, by itself, destroy Nelson's campaign? No single thing ever destroys a campaign alone, and it would be false to claim the marriage was the only factor. Nelson Rockefeller faced a genuine, powerful, ideologically motivated conservative movement that might well have beaten him regardless. Goldwater's rise was about far more than one man's private life. It was about a real and deep shift in the Republican electorate that had been building for years. But it is equally false, and it is the more common error, to wave the marriage away as a minor footnote. The historical consensus is clear that the scandal did real, measurable, Decisive damage. Political observers at the time and historians since have pointed directly at the marriage as a major reason Rockefeller failed to secure the 1964 nomination. His lead vanished when he married Happy. The birth of their child at the worst possible moment demonstrably renewed the damage right before the deciding vote. In a contest that close, in a party that divided, a factor that large was not a footnote. It was, plausibly, the margin. And the margin is everything. So, the honest verdict is this. Happy Rockefeller's marriage did not single-handedly destroy Nelson's campaign in the sense of being its only cause. But it was very likely the decisive blow, the factor that turned a winnable fight into a loss in a moment when American political history was balanced on a knife's edge. Without the scandal, Rockefeller might have won California, stopped Goldwater, and changed the entire trajectory of the Republican Party and perhaps the country. With it, he lost. That is not a footnote. That is a hinge of history, and a marriage was sitting right on top of it. And there is one more thing that honesty demands, and it is about Happy herself, because she is the person this story is most unfair to. Happy Rockefeller did not set out to destroy anyone's campaign. She was not a schemer or a villain. She was, by every account of the people who knew her, a genuinely warm, kind, decent woman who fell in love and paid an enormous price for it. She endured savage public judgment. She was branded a homewrecker and a mother who abandoned her children in headlines across the country at a time when there was no defense a woman in her position could offer that the public would accept. She bore that judgment largely in silence for the rest of her life, and she stayed with Nelson. Whatever the scandal had cost them both, their marriage was, by all accounts, a genuine and loving one. It lasted until Nelson's death in 1979. She had given up an enormous amount to be with him. Her reputation, the daily custody of her children, her privacy, her peace, and she did not walk away from what she had paid so dearly for. She remained a Rockefeller, quietly, with dignity. Through his vice presidency and his death and the long decades of widowhood that followed, until her own death in 2015 at the age of 88. There is a kind of vindication in that endurance, quiet as it was. The public that had branded her a homewrecker in 1963 expected, on some level, that such a marriage would prove the cynics right, that a union born in scandal would curdle, that she would be discarded in time the way she had supposedly discarded others. It did not happen. She and Nelson stayed married for 16 years, until death parted them, and she spent 36 more years as his widow, without ever selling her story, ever settling scores, ever trying to rewrite the public record of what had happened. She simply lived with dignity and let the marriage's own longevity be the only rebuttal she ever offered. A love the country had called illegitimate outlasted nearly every marriage that had judged it. So go back, one last time, to that hospital in the spring of 1964, and the pacing father, and the newborn son, and the campaign about to die. The cruel irony at the center of this whole story is that the thing which destroyed Nelson Rockefeller's dream was not a betrayal or a crime, or a hidden sin finally exposed. It was a marriage. It was love. It was two people who genuinely wanted to be together, choosing each other over everything else, including, as it turned out, the presidency. Nelson Rockefeller could very likely have been president if he had simply stayed in a loveless marriage and kept Happy as a discreet secret, the way powerful men had always done. He chose not to. He chose her openly, and he paid for that choice with the ambition of his entire life. Was it worth it? Only they could ever have answered that. And the fact that they stayed together for 16 years, through all of it, until death, suggests they believed it was. He lost the presidency. He kept Happy. And a private, cheerful, kind woman from Philadelphia, who never wanted power and never sought the spotlight, became, without ever intending to, one of the most consequential wives in the history of American politics. Not because of anything she did, but simply because a man loved her enough to give up a throne, and a country that did not like broken homes made him pay the price. That is the real story of Happy Rockefeller. Not a scandal. A love that cost a presidency, and a woman who spent the rest of her life being blamed for the crime of being loved.